The BRICS nations are pushing for reforms that better reflect the economic realities of the 21st century. They argue that the current frameworks of the IMF and WTO disproportionately benefit wealthy nations, failing to address the priorities of the global South. Among their demands are changes to the IMF's quota system, to give emerging economies more influence, and the restoration of the WTO's full dispute resolution capabilities. As a result, the global South is committed to reforming the current, Western-dominated financial system, even exploring the creation of alternative institutions to meet their needs. In this video, we delve into the reasons behind the growing dissatisfaction with the IMF, and examine how IMF loans and policies have led to disastrous outcomes for both people and economies in various global South countries. Let's begin by looking at which BRICS or global South countries have suffered as a result of IMF loans and imposed policies. In January 1977, Egypt faced widespread civil unrest known as the bread riots, following the government's decision to cut subsidies on essential food items. This move was part of an effort to secure financial support from international bodies like the IMF. As a result, the prices of staples like bread, sugar, rice, and cooking oil skyrocketed, sparking protests in major cities like Cairo, Alexandria, and Suez. The unrest began on January 18th, with workers in industrial areas like Helwan initiating strikes and demonstrations. These protests quickly escalated, with students and other citizens joining in, culminating in mass demonstrations against the government's economic policies. The situation intensified as protesters attacked symbols of authority, such as police stations, government buildings, luxury hotels, and public transportation vehicles. In response, President Anwar Sadat deployed the military to restore order, resulting in clashes that led to around 80 deaths, over 550 injuries, and 200 arrests. Amid growing dissent, the government reversed its decision and reinstated the subsidies, stabilizing the situation. During a severe economic crisis in the late 1990s, Brazil turned to the IMF for assistance to stabilize its currency and economy. In November 1998, the IMF approved a massive $41.5 billion support package, with conditions that Brazil implement austerity measures and structural reforms to reduce fiscal deficits and promote economic stability. The austerity measures included deep cuts in public spending, tax increases, and public sector reforms. These policies resulted in reduced government spending on essential services such as healthcare, education, and social security, disproportionately impacting low-income and vulnerable populations. The public strongly opposed these measures, with widespread protests and strikes erupting across the country. Critics argued that IMF-imposed policies worsened poverty and inequality, hindering economic growth and social development, leading to increased unemployment and social unrest. Despite these challenges, some analysts argue that the austerity measures and structural reforms were necessary for Brazil's long-term economic stability. They claim these policies helped control hyperinflation, restored investor confidence, and laid the groundwork for future economic growth. In 2005, Brazil's early repayment of its IMF loans under President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was seen as evidence of the country's regained financial autonomy and improved economic health. However, the effectiveness of IMF-imposed austerity measures remains a topic of ongoing debate. While economic reforms introduced through international financial assistance may have contributed to macroeconomic stabilization, the social costs of these policies were significant, raising important questions about the balance between economic progress and social welfare. The cases of Brazil, Morocco, Nigeria, Venezuela, and Indonesia in the 1980s and 1990s underscore the complex interplay between international financial assistance, domestic policy implementation, and the socio-economic realities faced by local populations. These events demonstrate the delicate tension between the necessity of economic reform and its impact on the broader society, often highlighting the severe consequences for vulnerable groups. In May 1981, Morocco was faced with severe economic challenges, including a significant budget deficit and a mounting external debt. In an effort to stabilize the economy, the Moroccan government, led by King Hassan II, entered into an agreement with the International Monetary Fund, IMF. This agreement required the implementation of stringent austerity measures, including the reduction of subsidies on essential food items such as flour, sugar, oil, milk, and butter. These cuts in subsidies had immediate and severe consequences. The prices of basic staples skyrocketed. Flour increased by 40%, sugar by 50%, oil by 28%, milk by 14%, and butter by a staggering 76%. The rapid increase in food prices sparked widespread unrest, culminating in the Casablanca bread riots on May 29, 1981. Thousands of impoverished residents from the city's working-class neighborhoods took to the streets, targeting symbols of wealth such as banks, luxury stores, and high-end vehicles. In response, the Moroccan government deployed police and military units to suppress the protests with force. Official reports stated that 66 people were killed, but opposition sources claimed the death toll was much higher, with some estimates reaching 637. Many of the victims were young individuals from the country's slums. The government's brutal crackdown led to enduring social unrest and had lasting political consequences, as it underscored the stark divide between the economic reforms pushed by international institutions and the lived experiences of the Moroccan populace. This period in Morocco's history highlights the volatility of implementing austerity measures in societies that rely heavily on subsidized goods. The government's approach to quelling the riots exposed the deep tensions between international economic demands and domestic social realities. The events of 1981 remain a poignant example of how the interplay between economic policy and social stability can have far-reaching and often destabilizing consequences. In Nigeria, the mid-1980s brought about a severe economic downturn. The country was grappling with plummeting oil prices, mounting external debt, and dwindling foreign reserves. In response, General Ibrahim Babangida's government adopted a Structural Adjustment Program, SAP, in 1986, formulated in collaboration with the IMF. The SAP aimed to restructure the Nigerian economy by reducing dependence on oil exports, promoting non-oil sectors, and achieving fiscal stability. However, the immediate effects of these policies were harsh. The devaluation of the naira led to rampant inflation, driving up the prices of imported goods and essential commodities. The removal of subsidies further exacerbated living costs, disproportionately affecting low-income households. This economic strain led to widespread dissatisfaction and unrest, which culminated in the anti-SAP riots between May and June 1989. The protests began on May 24, 1989, with a peaceful demonstration by students at the University of Benin. The students marched with a mock coffin and green leaves, chanting slogans like, "SAP must go," "We are dying of hunger in the name of SAP," and "SAP is a vampire." What started as a student protest quickly escalated into nationwide unrest, with major cities such as Lagos, Ibadan, and Benin City witnessing mass protests, strikes, and violent clashes with security forces. The government responded with military force, resulting in numerous casualties and arrests. The SAP's harsh economic measures led to a contraction in the economy, rising unemployment, and a decline in public services. The austerity measures strained the social fabric of the country, increasing poverty and inequality. The unrest and the government's violent response further destabilized the political environment, eroding public trust in leadership. The SAP era left a lasting imprint on Nigeria's socio-economic landscape. While some argue that the reforms were necessary for long-term economic stability, the immediate social costs were profound. The period remains a cautionary tale of the challenges involved in implementing externally prescribed economic reforms without adequate social safety nets or consideration for the realities of everyday citizens. Similarly, in February 1989, Venezuela found itself in the midst of a severe economic crisis, driven by declining oil revenues and rising external debt. In response, President Carlos Andrés Pérez implemented a series of austerity measures recommended by the IMF. These measures, known as the Gran Viraje, or Great Turn, were aimed at stabilizing the economy through structural adjustments. However, the sudden and forceful implementation of these measures led to widespread public discontent. On February 27, 1989, protests erupted in the city of Guarenas, near Caracas, as commuters reacted to an increase in bus fares. The unrest quickly spread to Caracas and other cities, escalating into mass protests, riots, and looting. This period of social unrest came to be known as El Caracazo. In response to the riots, President Pérez declared a state of emergency and suspended constitutional rights. The government deployed military forces to suppress the protests, resulting in significant violence. Official reports claim that 277 people were killed, but independent estimates suggest that between 2,000 and 5,000 people lost their lives, many of whom were victims of security force actions. The Caracazo had profound political repercussions, eroding public trust in traditional political parties and institutions. The event is widely regarded as a catalyst for the rise of Hugo Chavez, who, as a lieutenant colonel, led a failed coup attempt in 1992 and later leveraged public dissatisfaction to win the presidency in 1998. The Caracazo remains a critical moment in Venezuela's history, symbolizing the deep societal divisions and the volatile consequences of abrupt economic reforms. In Indonesia, the late 1990s saw the country severely impacted by the Asian financial crisis, leading to a sharp depreciation of the Indonesian rupiah, soaring inflation, and widespread economic hardship. In response, President Suharto's government sought assistance from the IMF, securing a bailout package of approximately $43 billion in October 1997. The austerity measures imposed as part of the bailout led to widespread public discontent, culminating in protests and riots across the country. In May 1998, large-scale unrest broke out, particularly in Jakarta, where protesters targeted symbols of wealth and authority. The riots escalated into extensive looting and property destruction, and the Chinese-Indonesian community became a primary target of violence. The Indonesian government's response was to deploy military forces to suppress the unrest, which resulted in numerous casualties. Estimates of the death toll vary, with some reports indicating over 1,000 fatalities. The economic crisis had a devastating impact on Indonesia's political landscape, leading to the resignation of President Suharto after more than 3 decades in power. The events of 1998 demonstrated how economic hardship, exacerbated by international financial measures, can lead to social unrest and political upheaval. The events in these countries, Morocco, Nigeria, Venezuela, and Indonesia, illustrate the complex and often dangerous consequences of economic reforms imposed with the assistance of international financial institutions. While these measures may have been aimed at stabilizing the economy, the social costs were profound, leading to widespread unrest, political instability, and a lasting impact on the national psyche. These cases serve as critical lessons in understanding the delicate balance between pursuing economic stabilization and addressing the social realities faced by the population. The events of 1998 in Indonesia marked a critical juncture in the country's political landscape, a period defined by widespread social unrest that undermined confidence in President Suharto's government. After more than 3 decades in power, President Suharto was forced to resign on May 21, 1998, in the face of mounting pressure from both domestic protests and economic turmoil. This dramatic turning point led to what is known as the Reformasi era, a period characterized by significant democratic reforms, greater political openness, and an unprecedented shift toward a more transparent and participatory political system. However, while the political changes that followed were monumental, the social and economic consequences of the 1997-1998 Asian financial crisis were far-reaching. The crisis, combined with the economic measures imposed by the International Monetary Fund, IMF, had lasting effects on Indonesian society. The IMF mandated austerity measures, which included cuts in subsidies, devaluation of the national currency, and fiscal reforms, deeply affected the public's perception of both the IMF and the policies it advocated. These measures not only contributed to inflation and rising unemployment, but also strained the provision of essential public services, leading to widespread dissatisfaction and distrust in both international financial institutions and the local government. Turning now to Pakistan, the country's engagement with the IMF dates back to 1988 and has involved multiple programs aimed at stabilizing the economy and addressing fiscal imbalances. Each of these agreements has brought with it a set of austerity measures, including cuts in subsidies for essential commodities, currency devaluation, and reductions in public spending. While these measures were intended to stabilize Pakistan's economy, they often came at a significant social cost, leading to protests and political instability. For instance, the structural adjustment programs prescribed by the IMF during the 1980s and 1990s required Pakistan to implement deep cuts in public sector spending and reduce subsidies on goods such as food, fuel, and energy. These policies led to a sharp increase in the cost of living, disproportionately affecting low-income families. The pressure on the population intensified during the tenure of President Pervez Musharraf, as Pakistan secured nearly $2 billion in IMF support. The austerity measures tied to this financial aid included further cuts in public spending, tax increases, and subsidy reductions, all of which exacerbated economic hardship for the Pakistani people. Protests broke out in response, and these economic challenges played a significant role in the country's ongoing political instability. In October 2024, the Pakistani government raised taxes by 40% as part of a new IMF-backed bailout agreement, sparking widespread protests and unrest. Critics argue that such measures have led to even higher inflation rates, rising unemployment, and a further weakening of public services. Despite the protests, proponents of these reforms assert that such sacrifices are necessary for long-term economic stability, arguing that fiscal consolidation and structural reforms are essential for Pakistan to address its economic vulnerabilities. Shifting focus to Kenya, the 1990s saw the implementation of IMF-backed structural adjustment programs, SAPs, aimed at resolving the country's fiscal deficits and stagnation. These reforms, which included the privatization of state-owned enterprises and reductions in government spending, were intended to modernize the Kenyan economy. However, the social consequences of these policies were severe and far-reaching. As part of the SAPs, Kenya sold off many state-owned enterprises, including key assets such as Kenya Airways and the Kenya Commercial Bank. The privatization agenda also extended to over 100 firms, including 43 tea factories, which were sold to private farmers. The government's aim was to reduce the fiscal burden and encourage efficiency. At the same time, however, public spending in critical sectors like health and education was significantly cut. This led to the introduction of user fees for essential services that were once subsidized, such as healthcare and education. The result was an increase in the cost of basic services, making them less accessible to Kenya's most vulnerable populations. The economic reality in Kenya during the early 1990s was grim. From 1991 to 1993, the country experienced its worst economic performance since independence, with a contraction in GDP and a decline in agricultural production. The effects of SAPs, including reductions in subsidies and public expenditure, disproportionately affected low-income households, leading to higher levels of poverty and income inequality. The introduction of user fees for healthcare and education further exacerbated the situation, contributing to poor health outcomes and a decline in educational attainment. The Kenyan public's discontent with these reforms was palpable, and protests became a regular feature of the political landscape. Many citizens viewed the structural adjustment programs as externally imposed, poorly suited to Kenya's unique context, and insufficiently focused on the social safety nets needed to protect vulnerable groups. Critics argued that the rapid pace of privatization and austerity measures, implemented without adequate attention to the country's existing economic and social structures, led to widespread unemployment and underemployment. Moreover, the focus on market liberalization failed to address deeper institutional challenges, such as corruption and inefficient governance, which hindered the effectiveness of the reforms. Now, let's examine the broader criticisms of the IMF, particularly from countries in the Global South, including those in the BRICS group. Over the decades, the IMF has faced significant backlash for its lending practices, particularly the structural adjustment programs it imposed on developing nations in the 1980s and 1990s. These programs typically mandated austerity measures, privatization of state-owned enterprises, and trade liberalization. Critics argue that these policies have worsened poverty and inequality, as they often prioritize debt repayment and fiscal discipline over the welfare of citizens, especially the most vulnerable populations. One major criticism of the IMF is that its reforms often erode national sovereignty. By imposing strict economic policies as a condition for financial aid, the IMF is seen as limiting the autonomy of borrowing countries, dictating their economic strategies, and undermining their ability to design development policies that align with local needs. This dynamic is viewed by many as serving the interests of wealthier creditor nations, rather than the borrowing countries, fostering a system that prioritizes global financial stability over local development priorities. The IMF's governance structure has also come under scrutiny. Critics argue that the IMF's decision-making process disproportionately favors developed nations, whose economic power gives them greater influence over the fund's policies. This perceived bias has led to accusations that the IMF functions as a tool of neo-colonial influence, further eroding its legitimacy in the eyes of many developing nations. Another major point of criticism is the IMF's approach to debt restructuring. The IMF has often been accused of failing to provide sufficient relief to countries facing unsustainable debt burdens. Without a fair and transparent multilateral framework for debt restructuring, borrowing nations often find themselves trapped in cycles of borrowing and repayment, which stifles long-term economic growth and development. These issues have only compounded the economic challenges faced by many developing countries, hindering their ability to invest in crucial sectors such as health, education, and infrastructure. The IMF's fiscal consolidation policies, which typically involve reducing public spending on essential services like healthcare and education, have also had negative social impacts. By cutting investment in these critical areas, countries that follow IMF prescriptions often see a deterioration in the quality of public services, leading to poorer health outcomes and lower educational attainment among disadvantaged populations. These policies exacerbate existing social inequalities and undermine long-term development prospects. The criticisms directed at the IMF highlight the complex and often contentious relationship between the institution and countries in the Global South. While the IMF's policies are intended to stabilize economies and promote growth, the negative social and economic consequences of its programs suggest that more equitable and context-sensitive reforms are needed. These critiques underscore the necessity for global institutions like the IMF to reconsider their approach, ensuring that their programs foster sustainable development, respect national sovereignty, and prioritize the well-being of all citizens. We hope this discussion has been informative. If you found our content insightful or thought-provoking, please consider supporting us by liking the video and subscribing to our channel. Your support means a great deal to us. You can also explore more of our videos, which are featured on the screen now. Thank you for watching.